Picture this, a moonlit castle where the windows bend time and the clocks tell lies. A 17-year-old bride steps over the threshold and vanishes in plain sight. Her letters arrive home, in her handwriting, but not in her words. The feast tastes of childhood. The gardens smell like memory. The chapel whispers that suffering is holy. If every kindness is a cage, how do you escape a prison you can't see? And who profits while you disappear? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Welcome to the dark heart of medieval Europe, where political marriages weren't romantic fairy tales, but calculated transactions that could doom young women to fates worse than death. Tonight, you'll discover what really happened behind the walls of kingdoms that built their power on the systematic imprisonment and abuse of noble daughters. This isn't the sanitized version of medieval life you learned in school, where knights were chivalrous and princesses lived happily ever after. This is the brutal reality of how royal bloodlines maintained their authority through methods that would shock even the most hardened modern observers. The kingdom of Ravenshollow existed in what we now call the Ardennes region, straddling the borders between modern-day France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. For nearly 2 centuries, from 1298 to 1487, this seemingly prosperous realm attracted noble families from across Europe seeking advantageous marriages for their daughters. The kingdom's wealth was legendary. Its mines produced silver that filled the coffers of half the continent. Its armies were feared and respected. Its diplomatic influence extended from London to Rome. But beneath the glittering surface of courtly life lay a secret so horrifying that it would take centuries to fully uncover. The prosperity of Ravenshollow wasn't built solely on silver mines or military conquest. It was built on a systematic program of psychological and physical torture that transformed noble wives into broken shadows of their former selves, ensuring their complete obedience while extracting every possible political and financial advantage from their family connections. The mastermind behind this system was King Roderick III, who ruled Ravenshollow from 1334 to 1378. Contemporary chronicles describe him as a man of exceptional intelligence and ruthless ambition, someone who understood that medieval power structures depended not just on military strength, but on the careful manipulation of human psychology. Roderick had studied the works of ancient strategists, absorbed lessons from the Byzantine court's intricate political games, and developed his own twisted philosophy about how to maintain absolute control over both his kingdom and his enemies. Roderick's innovation was recognizing that noble marriages could serve purposes far beyond simple alliance building. Every princess or countess who entered his kingdom through marriage brought with her a network of family connections, political intelligence, and potential leverage over rival powers. But traditional medieval marriages allowed wives to maintain correspondence with their families, to receive visitors, to potentially influence their husband's policies. Roderick saw these freedoms as dangerous loopholes that could undermine his authority. His solution was elegant in its cruelty. New brides would be welcomed with elaborate ceremonies that impressed visiting dignitaries and reassured anxious families. For the first few months of marriage, these women would live apparently normal lives, writing letters home, receiving gifts from relatives, participating in court functions. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, their freedoms would be curtailed. Letters would be delayed or lost. Visitors would be turned away due to sudden illnesses or urgent court business. Social activities would be restricted for reasons that seemed perfectly reasonable on the surface. The true horror began when these women were moved to what Roderick euphemistically called the private apartments, a section of the castle that existed on no official architectural plans and was known only to a select group of trusted servants and guards. These weren't dungeons in the traditional sense. They were luxuriously appointed chambers designed to house noble prisoners in comfort, while systematically destroying their will to resist. Lady Blanche of Toulouse provides our most detailed account of life in Ravenshollow's private apartments. Her secret journal, hidden behind a loose stone in the wall of her cell and discovered during renovations in 1623, describes a world where physical comfort masked psychological torture of the most sophisticated kind. The rooms were beautiful, furnished with imported tapestries and fine furniture. Meals were prepared by skilled cooks using the finest ingredients. Servants attended to every physical need with apparent devotion and respect, but the isolation was absolute. No communication with the outside world was permitted. No visitors were allowed, not even from other parts of the castle. The women lived in a bubble of artificial reality where their captors controlled every piece of information they received about their families, their home countries, even the passage of time itself. Windows were fitted with specially designed glass that distorted the view outside, making it impossible to track seasons or weather patterns. Clocks were deliberately synchronized to run at different speeds, creating a sense of temporal disorientation that made resistance planning nearly impossible. The psychological manipulation was refined through decades of experimentation. Women were told that their families had disowned them, that their home countries had been conquered, that everyone they had ever loved was dead. These lies were supported by forged documents, fake witnesses, and carefully staged theatrical performances that seemed to confirm the worst possible news. Some women were shown actors dressed as their brothers or fathers, supposedly captured in battle and tortured, begging their daughters or sisters to cooperate with their captors to prevent further suffering. Food was used as both reward and punishment, but in ways that went far beyond simple deprivation. Meals would be seasoned with herbs that induced depression or anxiety. Favorite foods from childhood would be prepared perfectly, then snatched away moments before consumption, creating powerful associations between memory and loss. Some women were force-fed until they became ill, then denied food entirely until they begged for the privilege of eating, transforming one of life's basic necessities into a symbol of their complete dependence on their captor's mercy. Sleep deprivation was employed with scientific precision. Guards would wake prisoners at random intervals throughout the night, claiming urgent messages from their families or important court business that required immediate attention. These interruptions would prove to be false alarms, but the pattern of broken sleep created a state of chronic exhaustion that made clear thinking nearly impossible. Some women reported that after months of this treatment, they could no longer distinguish between dreams and reality, between genuine memories and the false scenarios their captors had implanted in their minds. The genius of Roderick's system lay in its appearance of legitimacy. Visiting dignitaries would be shown happy, well-treated wives who spoke glowingly of their life in Ravenshollow. These weren't actresses or imposters, but the actual noble wives who had been so thoroughly broken and conditioned that they genuinely believed their captor's version of reality. They would write letters to their families describing their contentment, their gratitude for their husband's protection, their complete satisfaction with their new lives. These letters were genuine, written without coercion because the women had been psychologically restructured to the point where they could no longer imagine any other existence. Princess Margot of Brittany's transformation illustrates this process with heartbreaking clarity. When she arrived in Ravenshollow in 1344, she was described by contemporary observers as spirited, intelligent, and fiercely proud of her family heritage. Her early letters home spoke of her determination to be a worthy representative of Brittany's interests, her plans to establish cultural exchanges between the kingdoms, her excitement about the political influence she might wield as a royal wife. Within 6 months, her correspondence had changed dramatically. She wrote about feeling homesick and confused, about strange dreams that seemed more real than her waking hours, about a growing sense that she had somehow disappointed her family and needed to work harder to deserve their continued love. Her handwriting, once bold and confident, became shaky and uncertain. Her vocabulary shifted from the educated, sophisticated language of her upbringing to simpler phrases that suggested either declining mental capacity or deliberate infantilization. By the end of her first year in Ravenshollow, Margot's letters read like the writings of a different person entirely. She expressed gratitude for her husband's patience with her failings, apologized repeatedly for being a burden on her birth family, and begged for forgiveness for unnamed sins that seemed to consume her thoughts. She described herself as weak, stupid and unworthy of the noble blood that flowed in her veins. Most chillingly, she insisted that her transformation was the result of finally understanding her true nature, claiming that her previous confidence had been nothing more than childish arrogance that needed to be corrected. The medical knowledge of the 14th century couldn't explain what was happening to these women, but modern psychology recognizes the techniques employed in Ravenshollow as sophisticated forms of brainwashing that wouldn't be formally documented until the 20th century. The combination of isolation, disorientation, false information, intermittent reinforcement, and systematic destruction of personal identity created what we now understand as learned helplessness on a scale that was unprecedented in medieval Europe. But Roderick's system served purposes beyond simply controlling individual wives. Each broken noblewoman became a source of intelligence about her family's weaknesses, fears, and secret plans. Under the influence of their psychological conditioning, they would reveal information about their father's military strategies, their brother's romantic entanglements, their mother's political alliances. This intelligence was then used to manipulate political situations across Europe, giving Ravenshollow influence far beyond what its military or economic power alone could have achieved. The kingdom became a spider at the center of a web that extended across the continent. Noble families, desperate to maintain contact with their daughters and sisters, would make concessions they never would have considered under normal circumstances. Trade agreements were signed under duress. Military alliances were formed to protect kingdoms from threats that Ravenshollow itself had secretly orchestrated. Marriage negotiations were conducted with families who had no idea they were dealing with people who held their female relatives as sophisticated prisoners. The economic impact of this system was staggering. Ravenshollow's treasury swelled not just from the dowries that accompanied each noble bride, but from the ongoing financial manipulation that their captivity enabled. Families would send regular gifts and monetary support, believing they were maintaining loving relationships with daughters who had chosen to embrace their new lives. These payments were presented as tokens of affection, but they were extracted through carefully orchestrated emotional manipulation that made refusal seem like betrayal of familial bonds. Lady Eleanor of Castile's case demonstrates how thoroughly this financial exploitation operated. Her father, Duke Fernando, initially provided a dowry of 12,000 gold pieces upon her marriage to Prince Edmund in 1351. Over the following 3 years, Eleanor's letters home spoke of various needs that arose in her new life. She required funds for charitable works that would honor her family's reputation. She needed money for elaborate court dress that would properly represent Castilian nobility. She sought support for religious foundations that would ensure prayers for her parents' souls. Each request was accompanied by detailed explanations that seemed perfectly reasonable. The charitable works were described as feeding hundreds of poor families during harsh winters. The court dress was necessary for diplomatic receptions where Eleanor would represent not just Ravenshollow but her birth kingdom's interests. The religious foundations would employ dozens of monks and nuns whose prayers would benefit both kingdoms. Duke Fernando, proud of his daughter's apparent piety and political acumen, sent the requested funds without hesitation. What Fernando didn't know was that these elaborate justifications were entirely fictional. The charitable works existed only on paper. The court dress was never made. The religious foundations were empty buildings staffed by actors who performed their roles only when visiting dignitaries needed to witness Eleanor's supposed good works. The money flowed directly into Ravenshollow's coffers, while Eleanor herself remained imprisoned in her luxurious cell, believing that her father had abandoned her and that she was dependent entirely on her captor's mercy for survival. The psychological conditioning required to maintain these deceptions was implemented through a carefully structured hierarchy of handlers. Each imprisoned noblewoman was assigned to a primary keeper, usually a woman of middle-class origins, who had been selected for intelligence, acting ability, and complete loyalty to the crown. These keepers weren't merely guards or servants, they were psychological manipulators who had been trained in techniques that combined elements of religious confession, medical treatment, and theatrical performance. Sister Agatha, who served as keeper to multiple noble prisoners between 1356 and 1374, left behind a detailed manual that was discovered in the castle's archives during the 18th century. Her instructions reveal the systematic nature of the psychological assault these women endured. Every conversation was scripted to reinforce specific beliefs about the prisoner's worthlessness, her family's abandonment, and her complete dependence on her captor's benevolence. Even casual remarks about weather or food were designed to subtly undermine the prisoner's sense of reality and self-worth. The manual describes how keepers would spend months learning each prisoner's personal history, psychological vulnerabilities, and deepest fears. They would study samples of handwriting from family members, learn regional accents and dialects, and memorize details about childhood experiences that could be used to create convincing false memories. Some keepers became so skilled at impersonation that they could write letters in the handwriting of the prisoner's mother or sister, creating fake correspondence that seemed to confirm the worst possible interpretations of family relationships. Physical appearance was manipulated as systematically as psychological state. Mirrors in the private apartments were made from polished metal that distorted reflections, making the women appear haggard and aged even when they were physically healthy. Lighting was carefully controlled to create shadows that emphasized flaws and minimized attractive features. Clothing was provided in sizes too large or too small, creating that were either a sense of physical awkwardness that reinforced feelings of inadequacy and shame. The women's hair became a particular focus of psychological manipulation. In medieval culture, a woman's hair was considered one of her most important features, a symbol of beauty, virtue, and noble status. The keepers would alternately pamper and neglect their charge's hair in patterns designed to create maximum emotional instability. One week might involve elaborate styling with imported oils and decorative pins, followed by periods where the hair was deliberately tangled, unwashed, or roughly handled during supposedly routine maintenance. Some women reported that their hair was cut without warning during the night, supposedly to prevent the spread of lice or other health concerns. They would wake to find their most prized feature shorn away, then be told that their families had specifically requested this action because long hair was inappropriate for their new station in life. The psychological impact of these violations was devastating, particularly because they were always presented as necessary medical procedures or expressions of familial concern rather than deliberate cruelty. Religious manipulation formed another cornerstone of the system. Medieval noblewomen were typically devout Christians who found comfort and identity in their faith. The keepers exploited this devotion by creating elaborate theological justifications for the prisoner's suffering. They would claim that God was testing the women's virtue through hardship, that their families had been punished for sins that required the daughter's suffering as penance, or that salvation could only be achieved through complete submission to their earthly masters. Fake priests and nuns were employed to provide religious counseling that reinforced these messages. These clerical impostors would hear confessions that were immediately reported to the keepers, creating detailed psychological profiles that could be used to refine the manipulation techniques. They would provide absolution for imaginary sins while insisting that the women's desire for freedom or contact with their families represented spiritual failings that required additional penance. The chapel within the private apartments was designed to support these religious deceptions. Stained glass windows depicted scenes of martyred saints, whose stories paralleled the prisoners' situations, suggesting that suffering was not only normal but holy. The altar was positioned so that prisoners could see their own distorted reflections in polished surfaces during prayer, creating subconscious associations between worship and self-loathing. Even the timing of religious services was manipulated to create sleep deprivation and disorientation, while appearing to follow normal liturgical schedules. Lady Catherine of Normandy's journal describes how these religious manipulations affected her psychological state. Initially, she found comfort in prayer and maintained her faith despite her circumstances. But as months passed and her spiritual counselors continued to insist that her suffering was divinely ordained, her relationship with God became a source of torment rather than solace. She began to believe that she was inherently evil, that her noble birth had been a mistake, and that only through complete self-abnegation could she hope to achieve salvation. The most insidious aspect of the religious manipulation was how it turned the women's own moral convictions against them. Their sense of duty, honor, and filial devotion became weapons used to ensure their continued cooperation with their captors. They were told that resistance to their fate would bring divine punishment, not just on themselves, but on their families and entire kingdoms. Their love for parents and siblings was transformed into a source of guilt that made any thought of escape seem selfish and wicked. Medical experimentation added another layer of horror to the prisoners' experiences. The royal physician, Master Guillaume, had studied at the medical schools of Paris and Bologna, where he had learned not just healing arts, but theories about human anatomy and psychology that were considered advanced for his time. Under King Roderick's direction, Guillaume used the imprisoned noblewomen as subjects for experiments designed to understand how physical treatments could affect mental states and behavior. These medical procedures were presented as healthcare designed to maintain the prisoner's well-being, but they served dual purposes as both research and torture. Guillaume would administer various herbal preparations that induced hallucinations, depression, or euphoria, carefully documenting how different substances affected behavior and compliance. Some women were subjected to bloodletting that was precisely calculated to cause weakness without permanent damage. Others received treatments that deliberately induced illnesses that could then be cured, creating cycles of suffering and relief that increased psychological dependence on their captors. The medical experiments extended to reproductive health in ways that were particularly cruel. Many of the imprisoned women were young wives who expected to bear children as part of their marital duties. Guillaume developed techniques for preventing pregnancy while maintaining the appearance of normal sexual relations with their husbands. This served multiple purposes. It prevented the complications that children might create for the deception. It caused psychological distress to women who had been raised to believe that childbearing was their primary purpose, and it provided opportunities for medical experimentation on female reproductive systems. Some women were told that their failure to conceive was evidence of divine displeasure or physical inadequacy. Others were informed that they had miscarried children they had never actually conceived, creating profound grief for losses that existed only in their manipulated memories. The psychological impact of these reproductive deceptions was devastating, particularly in a culture that valued women primarily for their ability to produce male heirs for their husbands' lineages. The castle's architecture itself became a tool of psychological warfare. Master builders working under Roderick's direction had created spaces that defied normal human spatial reasoning. Corridors would gradually narrow or widen as prisoners walked through them, creating subtle feelings of claustrophobia or agoraphobia without obvious cause. Staircases were built with steps of slightly varying heights, forcing occupants to constantly watch their footing and preventing the automatic, confident movement that comes with familiarity. Rooms in the private apartments were designed with optical illusions that made accurate perception impossible. Floors might slope imperceptibly toward one corner, creating balance problems that the women attributed to their own physical weakness. Walls were painted with patterns that seemed to shift and move in peripheral vision, contributing to the sense that reality itself was unreliable. Ceilings were constructed at heights that felt either oppressively low or unnaturally high, depending on the psychological effect the architects wanted to achieve. The acoustic properties of these spaces were equally manipulated. Sound-dampening materials prevented normal conversations from carrying between rooms, creating an eerie silence that made the women feel completely isolated even when others were nearby. Conversely, certain areas were designed to amplify whispers, allowing guards to monitor conversations while prisoners believed they were speaking privately. Hidden speaking tubes allowed voices to seem to come from empty air, contributing to the sense that the women were going mad or experiencing supernatural phenomena. Temperature control was another subtle form of torture. The private apartments featured an innovative heating system that allowed different rooms to be kept at precise temperatures. Some chambers would be maintained just cold enough to cause constant discomfort without obvious explanation. Others would be kept uncomfortably warm, leading to lethargy and difficulty concentrating. The temperature would be adjusted unpredictably, preventing the women from adapting to their environment and maintaining a constant state of physical unease. Lighting presented perhaps the most sophisticated element of architectural manipulation. Windows were fitted with colored glass that filtered natural sunlight in ways that disrupted normal circadian rhythms. Some chambers received only blue-tinted light that mimicked dawn or dusk, making it impossible to judge the actual time of day. Others were illuminated with reddish light that created feelings of anxiety and aggression. Artificial lighting from oil lamps and candles was carefully controlled to create specific moods and mental states. The manipulation extended to seemingly innocent details like door handles, which were made slightly smaller or larger than normal, requiring conscious effort to operate and preventing the automatic confidence that comes from familiar surroundings. Furniture was constructed with subtle imperfections that made it uncomfortable to use for extended periods. Beds were too soft or too firm, chairs were too high or too low, tables wobbled just enough to be annoying without being obviously defective. Lady Matilda of Burgundy's account describes how these environmental factors combined to create a sense of constant unease that she initially attributed to homesickness or adjustment difficulties. Only after months of imprisonment did she begin to recognize that her physical discomfort was deliberately engineered. By that time, however, the psychological conditioning had progressed to the point where she doubted her own perceptions and blamed herself for being unable to adapt to what her keepers assured her were perfectly normal living conditions. The staff employed in the private apartments were selected and trained with the same precision as the architecture itself. Servants were chosen for their ability to maintain elaborate deceptions while appearing genuinely caring and concerned. They would spend years learning to simulate authentic emotional responses to their charges' distress while never breaking character or revealing the true nature of their roles. These servants were rotated regularly to prevent genuine emotional attachments from forming, but the rotations were presented as normal household management rather than deliberate isolation tactics. A maid who had served faithfully for months would suddenly disappear, supposedly called away by family emergencies or transferred to other duties. Her replacement would express regret about the previous maid's sudden departure, while claiming to know nothing about her whereabouts or reasons for leaving. The psychological impact of these constant separations was profound. Just as the women began to form human connections with their caretakers, those relationships would be severed without explanation. This pattern taught them that emotional investment was pointless and that everyone in their lives was ultimately temporary and unreliable. They learned to suppress their need for human connection as a form of self-protection, further isolating themselves and making them more dependent on their captors for any form of social interaction. Some servants were trained to play specific psychological roles designed to reinforce particular aspects of the conditioning. One might present herself as a motherly figure who offered comfort while subtly undermining the prisoner's self-confidence. Another might act as a peer who shared gossip and secrets while actually gathering intelligence and spreading disinformation. A third might pose as a rebellious spirit who encouraged resistance while actually identifying and reporting any genuine escape attempts. The most skilled servants could maintain multiple personas simultaneously, adapting their behavior based on the prisoner's psychological state and immediate needs. They might offer genuine sympathy during moments of despair while planting suggestions during periods of hope, always working to guide their charges toward greater compliance and dependency. These performances required extraordinary acting ability and psychological sophistication that rivaled anything found in the royal courts of Europe. Master Willem, the castle's head of household operations, maintained detailed records of servant training and performance that reveal the systematic nature of this deception. New staff members underwent months of preparation before being allowed to interact with prisoners. They studied the personal histories of their assigned charges, practiced regional accents and mannerisms, and rehearsed hundreds of potential conversations and scenarios. The training included instruction in reading micro-expressions and body language to gauge prisoners' emotional states and adjust their approaches accordingly. Servants learned to recognize signs of hope, despair, anger, and resignation, responding with precisely calibrated reactions designed to guide their charges toward complete psychological submission. They were taught to identify and exploit individual psychological vulnerabilities while maintaining the appearance of genuine care and concern. Physical training was as important as psychological preparation. Servants learned to move with the grace and confidence appropriate to their supposed social positions, while concealing any evidence of their true backgrounds. They practiced handwriting styles that matched their claimed identities and memorized vast amounts of false personal history that could withstand casual questioning. Some were even taught to mimic specific regional cooking styles or craft techniques that would support their cover stories. The economic scope of this operation was staggering even by medieval standards. King Roderick employed hundreds of people in various capacities to maintain the deceptions surrounding just a few dozen imprisoned noblewomen. Actors, builders, servants, guards, physicians, and administrators all received wages and benefits that far exceeded normal medieval employment. The costs were justified by the enormous profits generated through the political and financial manipulation that the prisoners' captivity enabled. Detailed accounting records preserved in the royal treasury show that maintaining each imprisoned noblewoman cost approximately the same as supporting an entire noble household. This included not just the obvious expenses of food, clothing, and shelter, but the salaries of multiple staff members, the costs of constructing and maintaining specialized facilities, and the ongoing expenses of creating convincing false evidence to support the various deceptions. The return on investment was substantial. Each prisoner generated income through multiple channels: initial dowries, ongoing family payments, political concessions from their home kingdoms, and intelligence that could be sold or traded to other powers. Some imprisoned women were worth more to Ravenshollow's treasury than entire provinces, making their continued captivity one of the kingdom's most profitable enterprises. The system also generated indirect economic benefits that were harder to quantify but equally valuable. The kingdom's reputation for successful marriages attracted more noble families seeking alliances, creating a steady stream of new prisoners and associated profits. The intelligence gathered from these women provided advantages in trade negotiations, military planning, and diplomatic relations that enhanced Ravenshollow's power and prosperity throughout Europe. Lady Gwyneth of Wales provides perhaps the most detailed account of how the financial manipulation operated from the prisoner's perspective. Her secret diary, written in a cipher she developed using Welsh poetry meters, describes receiving regular updates about her family's financial situation that were designed to extract maximum monetary support while maintaining the illusion of normal familial relationships. She was told that her father was struggling with debts incurred during poor harvests, requiring her assistance to maintain the family's honor and prevent the loss of ancestral lands. The amounts requested were always specific and reasonable, accompanied by detailed explanations of how the money would be used to address particular crises. Her emotional investment in her family's welfare made it impossible for her to refuse these requests, even though she was beginning to suspect that some of the information she received might be inaccurate. What Gwyneth didn't know was that her father's finances were actually quite healthy, and the supposed crises were entirely fictional. The detailed explanations she received had been crafted by experts who understood both Welsh economics and her family's actual financial situation. The money she sent home was intercepted and redirected to Ravenshollow's treasury, while her family received forged letters expressing gratitude for assistance they had never requested and never received. The religious aspects of the deception extended beyond simple theological manipulation to include elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced the prisoner's sense of isolation and helplessness. Fake religious festivals were celebrated within the private apartments, supposedly honoring saints and holy days from the women's home regions. These celebrations seemed designed to maintain cultural connections and provide comfort, but they actually served to highlight how far the prisoners were from their real homes and families. The ceremonies were carefully researched and authentic in most details, making them psychologically convincing while serving the captor's purposes. Traditional foods would be prepared using recipes that matched the prisoner's childhood memories, but ingredients would be subtly altered to induce specific psychological effects. Familiar hymns would be sung with slight changes in melody or words that created subconscious feelings of unease and displacement. Some religious observances were entirely fabricated, presented as ancient traditions that the women had supposedly forgotten during their secular educations. These fake rituals often involved confessing sins or expressing gratitude for suffering, reinforcing the psychological conditioning while appearing to provide spiritual guidance and comfort. The prisoners would participate willingly, believing they were reconnecting with their cultural heritage, while actually submitting to further manipulation. Sister Marguerite, who served as the false abbess, overseeing religious activities in the private apartments, maintained records that reveal the sophisticated theological framework supporting these deceptions. She had studied at several convents across Europe, learning authentic religious practices that could be adapted for psychological manipulation purposes. Her knowledge of scripture, liturgy, and monastic traditions was encyclopedic, allowing her to create convincing religious experiences that served her captors' goals. The false religious instruction provided to the prisoners included elaborate explanations of why their suffering was spiritually necessary and beneficial. They were taught that their noble births had created spiritual pride that needed to be humbled through hardship. Their desire for freedom was characterized as selfishness that prevented them from achieving true holiness. Their love for their families was described as worldly attachment that distracted them from divine love. These theological justifications were supported by carefully selected biblical passages and saints' stories that seemed to validate the women's experiences while actually encouraging their continued submission. The prisoners were given extensive reading materials that appeared to be standard religious texts, but had been edited to emphasize themes of suffering, obedience, and surrender to divine will. Many women found genuine comfort in these readings, not realizing that their spiritual growth was being deliberately misdirected to serve their captors' purposes. The education provided to imprisoned noblewomen represented another layer of the systematic deception that defined life in Ravenshollow's private apartments. These women had received the finest educations available to medieval aristocrats, learning multiple languages, literature, mathematics, astronomy, and the complex social protocols that governed noble society. Their captors recognized that intellectual stimulation was necessary to maintain their psychological health, while simultaneously using their education as another tool of manipulation. Master Philippe, the castle's chief scholar, developed an elaborate curriculum that appeared to continue the women's intellectual development while actually serving to isolate them further from reality. Latin lessons focused on texts that had been subtly altered to include false historical information about their home kingdoms. They learned that their families had suffered military defeats, political scandals, or financial ruin that made their current circumstances seem fortunate by comparison. These fabricated histories were woven seamlessly into authentic classical works, making the deceptions nearly impossible to detect. Mathematics instruction included problems based on supposedly real economic data from their home regions, but the numbers had been manipulated to suggest poverty, decline, and social chaos. The women would spend hours calculating trade deficits, population declines, and military losses that existed only in their teacher's imagination. Their intellectual pride in solving complex problems was used against them, as each correct calculation reinforced false beliefs about the deteriorating conditions in their homeland. Language lessons took on particularly cruel dimensions. Women were taught new dialects and languages that they believed would help them communicate with visiting dignitaries from their home countries. In reality, these were invented languages that bore superficial similarities to their native tongues, but would render them unable to communicate effectively with genuine visitors. Some women spent months mastering these false languages, believing they were maintaining important cultural connections while actually deepening their isolation. The castle library contained thousands of volumes that appeared to be authentic historical chronicles, religious texts, and literary works from across Europe. But many of these books had been carefully edited or entirely fabricated to support the various deceptions being perpetrated. Maps showed their home kingdoms shrunk to tiny territories surrounded by hostile neighbors. Historical accounts described their families' decline from power and influence. Poetry collections included verses supposedly written by their brothers or childhood friends, expressing grief at their absence or anger at their supposed betrayal of family loyalties. Lady Isabel of Provence discovered the extent of these literary deceptions quite by accident when she noticed that a supposedly ancient text contained references to events that had occurred after the book's claimed publication date. Her attempts to point out this discrepancy to her tutors were dismissed as evidence of her declining mental capacity, caused by the stress of adjusting to married life. She was prescribed additional rest and medical treatments that made clear thinking even more difficult, while her discovery was used as justification for restricting her access to other books that might contain similar anomalies. The musical education provided in the private apartments followed similar patterns of sophisticated deception. Women were taught songs that supposedly came from their home regions, but had actually been composed by castle musicians to reinforce specific psychological themes. Lullabies from their childhood were altered to include subtle messages about abandonment and loss. Folk songs celebrating their family histories were modified to emphasize themes of decline and shame. Even instrumental music was composed using mathematical relationships that induced specific emotional states, from melancholy to anxiety to resignation. Lady Beatrice of Aquitaine, who had been an accomplished musician before her marriage, initially found great comfort in the opportunity to continue her musical studies. She learned new pieces that she believed would allow her to maintain her cultural identity and perhaps perform for visitors from her homeland. Only gradually did she realize that the music she was learning bore little resemblance to the authentic traditions of Aquitaine. But by then, her memories of the original songs had become confused with the false versions she had been taught. The women were encouraged to compose their own music and poetry as forms of emotional expression and intellectual exercise. These creative works were praised by their teachers and fellow prisoners, providing much-needed validation and human connection. What they didn't know was that their compositions were carefully analyzed for psychological insights that could be used to refine their individual conditioning programs. Personal metaphors, emotional themes, and artistic choices all became data points in elaborate profiles that tracked their mental states and predicted their responses to various stimuli. Artistic instruction followed the same deceptive patterns as other educational activities. Women learned to paint and draw using techniques that appeared traditional, but had been modified to produce subtle psychological effects. Color palettes were chosen to induce specific moods rather than achieve aesthetic beauty. Compositional rules were taught that created feelings of imbalance and unease in both the artist and viewers. Even the materials provided for artistic work were selected to support the overall psychological manipulation, with pigments that changed color over time, creating the impression that their artistic achievements were literally fading away. The women's artistic productions were displayed throughout the private apartments, creating the illusion of a vibrant cultural community while actually serving as tools of surveillance and control. Guards and keepers could monitor the prisoners' psychological states by analyzing changes in their artistic output. A shift toward darker colors might indicate depression that required intervention. More chaotic compositions could suggest growing resistance that needed to be addressed. The art that seemed to provide creative outlet and personal expression was actually another form of involuntary confession. Master Jean-Baptiste, the chief art instructor, maintained detailed analyses of each woman's artistic development that read like psychological case studies rather than educational assessments. He documented how specific techniques could be used to influence emotional states, how certain subjects or themes could trigger memories or associations, and how artistic criticism could be employed to undermine self-confidence while appearing to provide helpful instruction. The gardens within the private apartments represented perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated element of the entire complex. These appeared to be beautiful, peaceful spaces where the women could find solace and connection with nature. But every plant, pathway, and architectural feature had been chosen and arranged to serve specific psychological purposes. Flowers were selected for their subtle psychological effects rather than their beauty, with some varieties producing pollen that induced mild depression or anxiety, while others released fragrances that created feelings of homesickness and loss. The garden layouts followed principles derived from ancient Greek and Roman theories about how spatial relationships affected human psychology. Pathways were designed to create subtle feelings of disorientation, making it difficult for visitors to develop accurate mental maps of the space. Seating areas were positioned to provide views that seemed pleasant, but actually reinforced feelings of confinement and isolation. Water features were engineered to produce sounds that masked conversations while creating subliminal associations between natural beauty and captivity. Lady Margaret of Scotland found the gardens particularly meaningful because they reminded her of the Highland landscapes of her childhood. She would spend hours tending to plants that she believed came from Scotland, writing detailed observations about their growth and seasonal changes. What she didn't realize was that these plants had been carefully selected to mimic Scottish flora, while actually being varieties that had been bred to produce specific psychological effects. Her gardening activities, which seemed to provide comfort and cultural connection, were actually reinforcing her conditioning and deepening her psychological dependence on her captors. The seasonal changes in the gardens were artificially manipulated to create confusion about the passage of time and the relationship between the private apartments and the outside world. Plants would bloom and fade according to schedules that bore no relationship to natural seasons, making it impossible for the women to track calendar time or maintain accurate connections to the seasonal rhythms that had structured their previous lives. Some areas of the garden were kept in perpetual spring, while others remained locked in artificial winter, creating a dreamlike environment where natural law seemed suspended. The social dynamics among the imprisoned women themselves became another tool of psychological manipulation. The castle's administrators carefully managed which women were housed near each other, creating artificial communities that served their purposes while appearing to provide natural companionship and support. Women who might strengthen each other's resistance were separated, while those whose psychological profiles suggested they would reinforce each other's conditioning were encouraged to form friendships. These friendships were genuine on the women's part, providing much-needed human connection and emotional support. But they were also monitored and manipulated by the keepers, who would plant information and suggestions through one woman that would influence her friends. A prisoner might share concerns about her family's welfare with a trusted companion, not knowing that the companion had been given false information designed to reinforce those very anxieties. Group activities were organized that appeared to build community and provide entertainment, while actually serving surveillance and control functions. Evening gatherings, where women would share stories from their homelands, became opportunities to spread disinformation and assess the effectiveness of various deceptions. Collaborative projects like preparing special meals or organizing celebrations were structured to create artificial conflicts and dependencies that prevented the formation of genuine resistance networks. Lady Constance of Flanders describes in her hidden writings how these social manipulations affected her relationships with other prisoners. She genuinely cared for her companions and found comfort in their shared experiences, but she gradually became aware that conversations with certain women always left her feeling more hopeless and isolated. She began to suspect that some of her fellow prisoners were not entirely what they seemed, but her own psychological conditioning made it impossible for her to trust these perceptions or act on them effectively. The hierarchy among prisoners was carefully constructed to prevent unified resistance while maintaining the appearance of natural social organization. Women from more prestigious families were given slightly better accommodations and privileges, creating resentment and competition that divided potential allies. Those who showed signs of adjustment and compliance were rewarded with leadership roles in group activities, making them invested in maintaining the system that oppressed them all. Some prisoners were secretly recruited as informants, though they rarely understood the true nature of their role. They might be asked to report on the welfare of their companions out of apparent concern for everyone's health and happiness. These reports were used to identify women who were struggling with their conditioning and needed additional attention, while the informants themselves were praised for their caring nature and community spirit. The most psychologically devastating aspect of these social manipulations was how they turned the women's genuine capacity for love and friendship into weapons against themselves and each other. Their desire to help and support their companions was exploited to spread false information and reinforce conditioning. Their trust in each other became another source of isolation when they began to suspect that their most intimate relationships might be compromised. Physical exercise and recreation followed the same patterns of apparent kindness masking systematic psychological assault. Women were encouraged to maintain their health through various forms of physical activity that seemed designed to preserve their strength and vitality. But these activities were actually structured to create specific psychological effects while preventing the kind of physical conditioning that might enable escape attempts. Dancing lessons taught movements that seemed elegant and culturally appropriate, while actually being designed to create subtle physical imbalances that would make running or fighting more difficult. The women learned elaborate choreographed pieces that they believed preserved their cultural heritage, not realizing that the movements were gradually training their bodies to move in ways that would disadvantage them in any physical confrontation. Horseback riding was permitted in carefully controlled circumstances that appeared to provide freedom and recreation, while actually reinforcing the prisoner's sense of confinement. The horses were specially trained to respond only to specific commands given by authorized handlers, making it impossible for the women to use them for escape attempts. The riding trails were designed to create the illusion of covering great distances while actually following circular routes that never led more than a few hundred yards from the castle walls. Swimming and bathing activities took place in pools that had been engineered with hidden currents and depth variations that made them unsuitable for building the kind of swimming skills that might enable escape across rivers or moats. The women enjoyed these aquatic activities as refreshing breaks from their daily routines, not understanding that they were actually being trained to be helpless in water, while believing they were becoming more skilled swimmers. The medical care provided to the imprisoned women represented perhaps the most morally complex aspect of their treatment. On one hand, they received attention from skilled physicians who were genuinely concerned with maintaining their physical health. These doctors provided treatments for illnesses and injuries that were often superior to what was available to most medieval people, including members of the nobility in their home kingdoms. But this medical care was also systematically used to support the psychological conditioning and prevent escape attempts. Physicians would prescribe treatments for fabricated illnesses that actually served to weaken the women's physical capabilities or alter their mental states. They would provide detailed explanations of health problems that didn't actually exist, creating anxiety and hypochondria that made the prisoners more dependent on their captors' care. Some medical treatments were designed to create physical dependencies that would make escape attempts impossible, even if the psychological conditioning failed. Women might be given medications that they believed were treating chronic conditions, but were actually creating the symptoms they were supposed to cure. Others received treatments that gradually weakened their physical strength while appearing to maintain their health and vitality. The physicians themselves were often unaware of the true nature of their role in the broader system of imprisonment and conditioning. They genuinely believed they were providing appropriate medical care to women who were suffering from the natural stresses of adapting to new environments and marital responsibilities. Their medical training and professional ethics made them effective tools of the system, precisely because they acted in good faith while unknowingly serving the captor's purposes. Dr. Aldrich of Montpellier, who served as chief physician to the private apartments from 1358 to 1372, left detailed medical records that reveal how thoroughly the healthcare system had been integrated into the overall program of psychological manipulation. His notes describe treating numerous cases of what he diagnosed as melancholic humors and feminine hysteria, conditions that required extended treatments with herbs and procedures that would now be recognized as systematic drugging and physical manipulation. The pharmaceutical knowledge available to medieval physicians provided numerous opportunities for subtle manipulation that would be difficult to detect or prove. Herbal preparations could be adjusted to produce specific psychological effects while appearing to treat legitimate medical conditions. Pain medications could be provided or withheld to create patterns of suffering and relief that reinforce psychological conditioning. Even basic nutritional supplements could be modified to influence mood, energy levels, and cognitive function. The women's reproductive health became a particular focus of medical manipulation, as their ability to bear children represented both a potential complication for their captors and an opportunity for additional psychological control. Many prisoners were told that their failure to conceive was caused by medical conditions that required ongoing treatment, when in reality they were being given substances that prevented pregnancy while maintaining the appearance of normal marital relations. The psychological impact of this reproductive manipulation was devastating for women who had been raised to believe that childbearing was their primary purpose in life. They would blame themselves for their apparent infertility, seeking increasingly desperate medical treatments that actually served to maintain their childless state, while convincing them that their bodies were fundamentally defective. Some women were subjected to fake pregnancies, told that they had conceived and then later informed that they had miscarried due to their own moral or physical failings. These false pregnancies were created through a combination of herbal treatments that mimicked pregnancy symptoms and psychological suggestions that convinced the women they were carrying children. The supposed miscarriages were used to justify additional restrictions on their activities and to reinforce their sense of being cursed or fundamentally flawed. The integration of all these various systems of deception and control created a total environment where reality itself became unreliable for the imprisoned women. Every aspect of their daily experience was carefully crafted to support specific psychological goals while maintaining the appearance of normal, caring treatment. The sophistication of this approach was unprecedented in medieval Europe and would not be systematically studied and understood until the development of modern psychology centuries later. The women lived in a world where their own perceptions, memories, and judgments had been systematically undermined through months or years of careful manipulation. They could no longer trust their own senses to provide accurate information about their circumstances, their relationships, or even their own identities. This profound epistemological uncertainty made resistance almost impossible, as any plan for escape or rebellion required the kind of clear thinking and accurate perception that the conditioning was designed to prevent. The kingdom of Ravenshollow finally collapsed in 1487, not through military conquest or economic failure, but through the very system that had sustained its power for nearly 2 centuries. As the psychological conditioning techniques became more sophisticated, they required ever-increasing resources to maintain. The elaborate deceptions, the armies of actors and specialists, the constant creation of false evidence, all demanded expenditures that eventually exceeded even the substantial profits generated by the imprisoned noblewomen. More critically, the kingdom's reputation for successful marriages had attracted so much attention that maintaining the facade became impossible. Too many visiting dignitaries expected to see healthy, happy wives who could engage in sophisticated conversation and demonstrate genuine contentment. The broken women emerging from years of conditioning could perform these roles for brief periods, but extended interactions revealed the psychological damage that no amount of training could completely conceal. When the castle was finally abandoned, investigators found the private apartments exactly as they had been left, with all their sophisticated mechanisms for psychological torture intact. The discovery sent shockwaves through European nobility, not just because of the cruelty revealed, but because it forced them to confront how their own systems of arranged marriage and political alliance created vulnerabilities that could be so systematically exploited. The women's hidden journals and secret writings, discovered centuries later during renovations and archaeological excavations, provide our only direct testimony about experiences that challenged every assumption about human resilience and the nature of reality itself. Their words remind us that the most sophisticated forms of evil often disguise themselves as kindness, that the most effective prisons are built not from stone and iron, but from the manipulation of hope, love, and faith. Perhaps most chillingly, the techniques pioneered in Ravenshollow's private apartments were not lost when the kingdom fell. They were refined, adapted, and employed by other powers throughout history, proving that the human capacity for systematic cruelty evolves alongside our understanding of psychology and social control. The princesses in chains of medieval Europe were not historical aberrations, but early victims of methods that would resurface again and again whenever power sought to break the human spirit while maintaining the appearance of civilization. Tonight, as you walk through your own comfortable spaces, remember Isabel, Margot, Catherine, and all the others whose names were erased from history. They remind us that freedom is fragile, that reality can be manipulated, and that the price of power is often paid by those who can least afford it.